in doing so, helped by the Western cultural relativists, the useful idiots, as former Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin described the unknowingly who helped his cause. In my favorite country, Britain, Sharia courts are now officially part of the legal system. A lot of people don't know that. Very few people are aware of that. They have been empowered to adjudicate on financial disputes, on divorces, and on domestic violence. And there are many more examples of the rising of Sharia in Europe today. Halal food is served in many schools and universities. More women every day are forced to wear the burqa or the niqab. Islamic banks are mushrooming, and polygamy, female genital mutilation, honor killings, and Muslim men who refuse to shake hands with women are all part of 2009 Europe. And a few weeks ago, a British Muslim leader told his version of Britain under Sharia law. And according to the British Evening Standard, Anjem Choudary wants a pure Islamic state with Sharia law in Britain. He said that he would like to see the flag of Allah flying over Downing Street. Ladies and gentlemen, this would mean the end of our precious liberties, even though with Gordon Brown in office, one might not see easily the difference. Sharia. Sharia means the end of our hard-won freedom. For Sharia denies the equality of men and women and Muslims and non-Muslims. It does not allow Muslims to leave Islam. Renegades, apostates should be killed according to Islam. Sharia advocates slavery and does not recognize democracy. As a matter of fact, Sharia is exactly the opposite of democracy. And unfortunately, among European Muslims, the support for this creeping Sharia law is indeed substantial. Last year, the British Centre for Social Cohesion released a survey held on the British Muslim students. And some of the outcomes were indeed horrifying. 32% said that killing in the name of Islam is justified. And 40% of the British Muslim students said that they supported the introduction of Sharia law instead of British law. But please, don't think it's only a European problem. We are worse off than the United States, but also in the United States there is a process of Islamization. There are numerous examples. For instance, Muslim cab drivers who refuse to transport passengers possessing alcohol or guide dogs. Muslim students demanding separate housing on campus and separate hours for Muslim women in gyms and swimming pools. And many US journalists who I personally met who told me that they self-censor themselves, being afraid of being sued and taken to court. And as I said, these Muslims are aided by the present-day useful idiots. And the classic example of my own country is the former Attorney General, what we call the Minister of Justice. Just after the Dutch filmmaker and criticaster Theo van Gogh was murdered by a jihadist in the streets of Amsterdam, our former Attorney General was of the opinion, that was his first reaction, that blasphemy should not longer be a dead letter. And a few years later, he even said in the Dutch parliament that he was willing to introduce Sharia if 2/3 of the Dutch people would advocate that. Fortunately, there are also some politicians who are not giving in. Former Republican US Congressman Tom Tancredo is one of those people. Last year, he introduced his Counter-Sharia Jihad Prevention Act. And this bill would bar the entry of people who advocate Sharia law in the United States. And this is exactly what we need. brave leaders who have the courage to do something against the growing Islamization. Ladies and gentlemen, we have no alternative than to stop the Islamization of the West. Because if we don't, we will roll back for centuries. It will mean the end of our civilization. If we don't act now, we will betray our Western values. We will lose our culture, and we will lose our democracy, and we will lose the dearest of our many liberties, and that is the right to speak our mind. And unfortunately, as I stated in the beginning of my lecture, free speech already is no longer a given in Europe. Last February, I tried to visit Britain, a fellow EU country. I was invited to give a speech in the House of Lords. However, upon arrival in the United Kingdom, I was refused entry. I was detained for a couple of hours in a detention center and then sent back to the Netherlands. But how much would I have loved to be able to remind the British audience of a great man who once spoke in the British House of Commons. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan, the former governor of this great state, California, gave a speech that very few Europeans at that time appreciated. President Reagan called upon the West to reject communism and to defend freedom. He introduced a new phase called evil empire. And President Reagan's speech at that time stands out as a clarion call to preserve our liberties. I quote President Reagan in the House of Commons. He said that if history teaches anything, it teaches self-delusion in the face of unpleasant facts is folly. And what Reagan, of course, meant is that you cannot run away from history. You cannot escape the dangers of ideologies that are out to destroy you. Denial is no option. Communism from the 80s is Islam from today. Ladies and gentlemen, just like the British ban, the decision of the Amsterdam Court of Appeal to prosecute me for fitna and my views on Islam is a major blow dealt to the freedom of speech in Europe. They are full-fledged attacks on freedom of speech in order to appease Muslims. Both are major victories for Islam and for all who hate the freedom of speech. And whether I personally end up in jail is not the most important issue. I gave up my freedom 4.5 years ago when I came under full-time police protection because of death threats from Muslims and terroristic groups like Al-Qaeda. And in the last few years, indeed, I lived in different safe houses, in army barracks, and yes, even in prison cells in order to be safe. But it's not about me. It's not about Geert Wilders. The real question is, will free speech be put behind bars? And we have, ladies and gentlemen, we have to defend the freedom of speech. And I propose the withdrawal of all hate speech legislation in Europe. I propose a European First Amendment. In Europe, we should defend freedom of speech like you Americans do. Recently, I was very proud to be invited and show fitna in the heart of your great democracy in the US Senate on the invitation